let's give it a go.
Cool.
I'm just gonna have a notepad here in case that helps.
All right. Hi, everybody. So we're recording now. I'm here with my good friend Matt Myers. Matt, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Matt, as Nick said. I guess I should say what I do. So I'm a PhD student at Tulane. So basically what I do is social and political philosophy, mainly democratic theory. So yeah, it's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
So I've gathered Matt here today to talk about John Rawls and Rawls theory because it's very complicated, but it's also very important. Would you agree with that, Matt?
I would, yes.
Okay.
And Rawls is fun, so there's that too.
He is, yeah. Once you sort of understand where he's coming from and what the hell he's doing with all them words, he's very fun. So Rawls's first book is A Theory of Justice, right? And his later sort of theory, what he calls his theory, is justice is fairness. So when Rawls uses the words justice, what exactly is he talking about, Matt?
So he's talking about political justice, but damn, dog. I don't know about that one. We might have to scrap this bad boy. Do me a solid really quick. What are the questions that are coming my way, Nick?
Hey, you're a good philosopher. Answer a question with another question.
Dude, yeah.
I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. So I'm thinking about the historical context here. So in analytic philosophy at the time, people aren't really talking about political philosophy. We're assuming that, well, justice is some sort of liberalism like the United States is doing, and that seems to be working out pretty well. This is like the 1970s. But there's this creeping utilitarian sort of influence, right? And that's sort of where Rawls sort of situates himself against.
Right.
So what would maybe a utilitarian conception of justice look like?
Yeah. So if we're talking about a utilitarian conception of justice, it's pretty simple. So the idea is that what is just is what brings the greatest good for the greatest number. And so Rawls is totally counterintuitive. We don't want to have this sort of situation where, and it's actually, I find it kind of hard to do without painting or without a whiteboard in front of you or something, where you've got this situation where it's okay, you've got on a scale of well-being where one group is at 99 and one group is at 1. And so you've got 100 overall. You've got 100 utility there. So the idea from utilitarian perspective is that society would be more just than a society where you have, say, 49 in one group and 50 on the other. So since the utility is overall less, even though you're closer to equality or something, the utilitarian is going to say that first case is better, which seems kind of ridiculous to most people.
So the utilitarian doesn't have to respect equality?
It doesn't seem like they do.
Okay.
I mean, there might be some rule where you say, if you're some sort of rule utilitarian or something, you might be I've got this thing that tells me that makes things better. I don't know. But all in all, the general idea seems to be that what you're going to do is go with the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens. There's also these sort of counterintuitive cases too, where you can say things if it's better for the majority of the citizens to totally oppress say 10% of the population or something, it's that's what we do.
Yeah.
Under this sort of utilitarian conception. So you can get to some really crazy ideas friggin' enslaving portions of the population and stuff like that. So Rawls comes along, totally challenges this utilitarian conception, like you were saying, that is the predominant view at the time, and says, well, no, we're gonna rock with something different. So
yeah, and we'll get into the way in which he stipulates his theory against utilitarianism, because that's really the meat and potatoes of what he's doing. But he, in the course of his writing, he stipulates two principles of justice. So as you just said, The principle of justice for utilitarianism is maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. If you're rule utilitarian, maybe you have a second rule that says, well, don't violate these rules, depending on your conception. So Rawls has two principles of justice, right?
Yep.
Do you remember what the first one is?
Yeah. So the first one is basically, it's basically to respect certain, or everyone has these certain liberties. So it's basically just sort of like a classical liberal view where we have everyone has these rights.
Yeah.
So everyone in society is going to have certain basic rights, typically the same ones that come to mind, if you're like, well, what rights do you have? These are the ones that are going to come to mind. So something like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that sort of stuff, assembly, petition, the regular stuff. So that's the first sort of principle of justice that he has. And then do you want to go ahead and talk about the next two as well?
Let's talk about the second one, and then let's talk about why they're two different principles.
Yeah, cool. So then you get the second principle of justice, which is kind of split into it's kind of like 2A and 2B, or something like that, where the first part is the idea that there's this difference principle, which basically tells us that inequalities are permissible only if it goes to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. And then you get this second principle, or the 2B sort of thing, which is basically the idea that everyone, it's sort of like an equal opportunity idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so it applies to sort of I think he says offices and stuff like that. But I don't, which is kind of, I think, a bit misleading, because I don't think that it's just offices like we would think of, where it's political office or something like that. I think it's just as far as equal opportunity within society, generally speaking. But yeah.
And I was just looking over because I have the principles over here. Yeah, he says, first, they are to be attached to all offices and positions open to all conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And then the second difference principle. If we're going to have inequalities, then those inequalities have to, how did you phrase it? Be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society.
Yep.
Yeah. So I suppose, why are those two principles? Why can't you just say, okay, we got rights plus we got equality of opportunity?
So I think
so let's say that an inequality. In order to remove an inequality in our society, we have to violate some rights. Would we be allowed to do that under a Rawlsian scheme?
No, not if it's, especially not if it's the rights that he's identified. So he says, what's his term? It's like a lexical priority. I think
lexical priority. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, look, one is, it goes in the order that he provides it, right? So one is the most important thing, or principle of justice. One is the most important thing. So we have to prioritize these liberties. So if we're going to be, walking on your rights or whatever, or disrespecting them in some sense, in order to benefit our distributive justice, that's not going to work. So we can't do that. But how exactly did you phrase that question again? Because I feel like there was something else that could be said there, and it's totally slipping my mind now.
I was just asking if the later principles, so equality of opportunity or inequality or something like that, if we wanted to, if it would increase equality of opportunity, why couldn't we violate basic rights? And I think you answered that by saying
cool.
Lexical priority. The reason, answer I was looking for, is the reason he has two principles of justice is because the first one stipulates the rights. And as you said earlier, Rawls he's a contract theorist. He's just like Locke and our homies George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, proud Virginians like you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
He cares about rights, and he thinks that rights should be the foundation of a well-functioning just society, which the utilitarian does not have to respect. So his whole thing is, how do you have these rights, but also how do you create a society where certain people don't own all the property, or things like that. He
Yeah,
doesn't want to go like a full libertarian route, right? He doesn't think that rights alone get us to where we need to go, right?
he does not.
Yeah.
And that's why you get the sort of like, or that's why you get these principles that address distributive justice. And he thinks that they're the ones that we would agree to as rational people, right? So it's like, and I'm trying to avoid, because I know you said that you also had like the original position thing separated out. But like, one of the main reasons why he thinks that we are going to accept this idea of the difference principle is because it's in our, if we were like, putting this together, we're going to adopt this sort of like maximizing the minimum idea, where it's like, I don't know what I'm going to get because I'm, behind my veil of ignorance and all this fun stuff. So the one thing that I'm absolutely going to go to bat for is this idea that no matter what my position is, if I'm at the bottom of the barrel, it's going to be the best of a bad situation, right? So he's like, that's the rational thing to do. So that's what we're going to run with. I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know how far you want to take the second, or you want to rock with I guess evaluating these principles, but like, I think that there's some like really interesting stuff to say about whether or not people would in fact endorse those principles. I don't know if that's something you want to touch on during this whole thing, but like, but yeah, I'm going to pitch that to you for after you ask questions if you want to, because I think it's fun to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I would want to do that after we get through the original position, because
Cool.
that's like the why we should, and then we can talk about why we might not. But before we get to the original position, what is distributive justice?
So
What
when
does
we're
that mean?
talking about, yeah, so when we're talking about distributive justice, I guess the word I want to use is goods. So we're talking about distributing certain
Like
goods.
stuff.
Yes. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like, for the sake of simplicity, let's say it's stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about distributing stuff. So when we're talking about distributing goods stuff, what we're saying is, what's a just distribution? So who should get what, and why is sort of the idea. So when we're talking about distributive justice, we're saying, what's a just distribution of these goods that we have? And so with Rawls, the idea seems to be that there are certain things that can impact this distribution that are totally morally arbitrary and that we want to get rid of, or that we want to like in some way negate. So like, for example, if you're lucky enough to be born into an extremely wealthy family, or if you're just born, more intelligent than most people, whatever, those sorts of things. So it's like, these are morally arbitrary, he says. So it's like, you haven't done anything to deserve these things. These are just totally a matter of luck. And so what he wants to do is say, okay, well, how do we distribute these goods and sort of negate those sorts of arbitrary things that we were just talking about there. So that's another reason why we get to these sort of like, or that's another reason why we get these things like this difference principle, and equal opportunity and stuff like that.
Gotcha. And he says that because he doesn't think that the current sort of scheme, the United States as it stands, both in his day and maybe now, accurately represents that equality of opportunity.
I do not think that he thinks that it does.
Heard.
Yeah.
Okay. And just before we get on, because still the redistribution of goods is sort of abstract. What is one mechanism in which Rawls' system would allow us to redistribute goods, or what is one system in which it does now?
Sure. So I think the simplest one is like taxation.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about redistributing goods, you can think of it as like a sort of like, I guess one that you might think of here would be like a sort of like progressive taxation, or something like that.
And tax credits.
Yeah. So I think that one like that might be really good with him would be something like a sort of inheritance tax,
Mm.
because it's like, I don't know. I guess it's like, um, whoever's going to be inheriting your goods or whatever, it's just a matter of luck. So that might be one that would be particularly good to think of when you're talking about redistributing, especially in like Rawlsian like sort of terms.
Gotcha. So he wants to try to find this way to, make sure that the rich and the sort of the morally arbitrary aren't necessarily undeserving. They can still live good lives. They still may well be rich, but he wants to make sure that they aren't rich at the expense of the people who are working hard and sort of doing their best, but just can't overcome these sorts of conditions. Okay. I can see how that might be morally justifiable. I can see how that might be like morally praiseworthy. But why does Rawls think that we should all adopt this position? Because, if we all have these basic rights and he believes in democracy and all these things, surely we would all have to agree to adopt this plan, right?
Yeah. So he's a social contract theorist, as you mentioned. So the idea is that this is the kind of thing that rational rational members of society are going to agree to. So it seems like, to answer this question, it seems like I have to talk about the original position and all that fun stuff. So the idea here is that, basically, as we're talking about the original position,
First of all, what is the original position?
Yeah, so the original position is this thought experiment.
And what do you mean by thought experiment?
So it's not something we're actually doing. It's a sort of like case that we're imagining, in order to test our intuitions about what sort of, in this case, principles of justice we would adopt, or what a just society would look like for us, right? And so what he wants to say is, we're going to imagine ourselves in this original position, and in this position, you don't know anything about yourself, or you have very limited knowledge. So it's like, you don't know, say, your gender, your native endowments, so how intelligent you are, how strong you are, that sort of stuff. You don't know anything about your background, what religion you practice, if any, that sort of thing. So it helps, like, it allows you not to be biased towards some particular thing, right? So it's like, you're not going to think, oh, I'm a Christian, so I'm going to adopt some policy that works well for me, right? So you don't know any of these things. So the idea then is, these are the sorts of things, or these two principles are the principles that we're going to adopt if we don't know anything about ourselves, because it's rational, right? So when we start thinking about, like, for example, the first principle, we start thinking about our rights, right? So we say, okay, I don't know anything about myself. I don't know what sort of religion I'm going to practice. So it only makes sense for me that we will not establish, say, some state religion or something like that, right? Why? Well, because I don't know what I practice, and I don't want to endorse some law that's going to discriminate against me. So similarly, when it comes to this second principle, and we're talking about, say, the difference principle, here the idea is, again, we don't know if we're going to be extremely wealthy or if we're going to be extremely poor. And so the idea is that it's rational to sort of endorse this view where we're maximizing the minimum. So like his term is going to be maxi-min. So what he's saying is that you're going to maximize the minimum, the floor, the worst possible position that you could be in, right? So in other words, if I'm going to be say particularly poor, I want that situation to be as good as it can be,
Yeah.
even though it's a particularly bad one. Um, so it comes down to, in a lot of ways, these being the sort of like principles that can be rationally endorsed. So it's like these are things that regardless of what your particular like religious affiliation, native endowment, whatever, regardless of whatever that is, these are the things that are going to be in your interest to actually endorse. So you think, say, this is what people are going to go with, and that's sort of how we end up with these two.
That is a very interesting way to justify your political principles.
Well, all rational people would endorse them.
Yeah, well, okay, so his idea, so all rational people would endorse them because they would be taking a monumental gamble if they didn't. So like,
I think that's a. Go ahead.
well, so like, let's say, because I don't know anything about myself or the people I represent or my family, friends, beliefs, none of that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to gamble with the possibility of being terribly impoverished or persecuted for my beliefs or, um, you know, uh, imprisoned unjustly, all these sorts of things. So present me with utilitarianism under the original position. If you present that to me, well, maybe I'd say, well, okay, greatest good for the greatest number. That sounds great, but there's no guarantee at all that I am in that group in which, I benefit. I may well be the people who gets persecuted or genocided for the greatest good.
Totally.
So it would be irrational under Rawls terms, right?
Correct.
For me to endorse utilitarian principles of justice, because I would be, I don't know, it's like betting your life on the Ohio lottery.
Totally. Yeah.
Statistically
and like
unlikely.
you said, yeah. And like you said, you also don't know anything about the person that you're sort of like representing or filling in for in the original position. So it's like, it could be that, you're endorsing some policy that's going to completely screw that person over, right? And so you totally don't want to gamble on that. So what do? Well, you say everyone has these rights. We're going to respect them across the board. Why? Well, because that's going to protect me no matter what, or benefit me no matter what the outcome is.
Nice. So I don't know. I suppose I'm just taken by the original position itself as like a mechanism. Why? And I think the more I think about it, the more it's a particularly effective way of getting one's argument across. I'm just curious if you have anything to say about that.
I mean, I think that as far as like thought experiments go, it's a really good one. Because I mean, I think that you would be hard pressed to find someone who actually, so like if you do the thought experiment, if you sit here and you actually think, okay, I don't know anything about this person that I'm representing in the original position, right? I think that you would be really hard pressed not to at least agree to the first principle. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, like, I think that it's really, really, really good. I think that I admittedly do think that you can have some arguments about the stuff that's going on in the second principle. And I think that that's like one of the really cool things, I guess, one of the things that I think is fun about it. But just as far as like a thought experiment goes, like, it's really freaking good. And I think that it does a lot of good work for him as far as it. I mean, getting both of them across, but definitely the first one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, Well, then I'd like to sort of close this portion. I wanted to do this so that, I could just get somebody else to talk about the original position because it's very complicated. And I think that we've done that, doing well to introduce Rawls and stuff like that. So I'll say that, if you came to this video for that, you're sort of free to go. Um, but Matt, I am curious, for the sort of after hours bit, how in what ways do you think that his argument falls so short for the second principle?
So it's not so much that I guess I want to say it falls short as much as like, I think that you can be persuaded, or at least I think that you can seriously consider some other options aside from the difference principle. Namely because it doesn't, especially if you have any sort of like egalitarian concern where you're like, okay, let's try to make sure that groups A and B are pretty close to the same level, right? Like if that's a concern to you, the difference principle is really not going to cut it.
No.
Because you can get these situations where you've got, okay, we've got to benefit the least advantaged group. Okay, so give them one level of well-being. We can give the group that's already, the most advantaged group, well, we can give them 100 additional units of well-being and just keep with these like, so we can take this from like here to here, oh, well, this group has to get a little bit better too, but you can just continue to like increase the sort of like inequality that you're seeing so long as you make the least advantaged group better off, or it's the best situation for them. So sure, we'll make sure this is the best situation for them, but we'll make it infinitely better for these groups that are already extremely well off, right? So in those sort of instances, I think that, so I guess to put it simply, I think that people who are concerned with like equality probably aren't like super convinced by what he's doing here, because you can be like, oh, wait a minute, that's like, we're still just getting these massive disparities in whatever, sort of like issue of well-being or resources or whatever we're talking about. We're just like getting this like huge gap here. And so I think that a lot of people can be totally put off by that. And I mean, if those are your concerns, or if you're, again, concerned with like the sort of like issue of equality, it seems to me like you've got pretty good reason to be bothered by that. But
yeah, I don't know, the way we talk about Rawls with like the distribution of wealth and things like that, like it sounds like, at least in the way we normally talk, it sounds like socialism or something like that, where we're taking from the rich and distributing it equally amongst the poor. But I like what you're saying there, in that it's a sort of, that's not at all what Rawls is saying. Like for Rawls, under the difference principle, say you have an entrepreneur who, creates this wonderful product, and that product creates a gabillion jobs, which raises the standard of living in the town. But that entrepreneur makes astronomical loads of money, and him and his family, her and her family are loaded for the rest of their lives beyond measure. But as long as they create a couple of jobs to really raise the standard of living, then Rawls is cool with that.
Absolutely, 100%, totally cool with it. Yeah, so it'd be like, that's a great example. We could take like Amazon or something, right?
Yeah.
So we can say, okay, Jeff Bezos is here, pandemic hits, and his wealth just, skyrockets, right? And his employees, maybe they make $1 or $2, whatever, right? They increase a little bit. Totally cool with Rawls, right? So yeah, like you're saying, it's definitely not the sort of like, it's not a sort of socialism type thing. It's a very different idea. So yeah, you end up with him basically, if the least advantaged group is getting better, the sort of gap between these groups doesn't matter. He doesn't care, just so long as the least advantaged group is improving in some way. Gotcha. Or it's to their best, it's the best thing for them. So that's the policy or whatever you have to uh, have to run with.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I'll ask another question.
Yeah, man.
So I assigned Rawls at the same time that I assigned Nozick, and I know that you're no like Nozick expert, but
Definitely not.
but they agree in that these basic rights are the things that sort of come fundamentally first. And where Nozick gets off the boat is exactly at that difference principle, and because Nozick would say, well, you sort of have no right to this other person's property, in order either in the form of taxation or any sort of redistributive mechanism at all. You'd probably need the state to do that, and Nozick is like, under zero moral authority does anyone have the right to take my stuff.
Yeah.
How would Rawls respond to that?
1 second, Nick.
Oh, heard. Is that your mom?
Sorry, man. No, it is not. It is a colleague. But I'm sorry.
I just call her mom.
So you're asking about Nozick, but I didn't catch the end of the question.
Oh, gotcha. So I said that, yeah, Rawls and Nozick agree in that these rights are important, but Nozick's going to get off the boat when it comes to the difference principle, because he's going to say, okay, maybe Rawls' maxi-min principle is good. Maybe that's something we would want to endorse, but he wants to say that in order to get there, in order to like actually redistribute wealth, whether it be in the form of taxation or cops repossessing property or something like that, you have to empower the state or some other like powerful entity to come and take stuff, and they have zero moral authority to do that. So I'm curious, how would a Rawlsian maybe respond to that sort of claim?
Oh,
because Nozick's going to say, the stuff you have, as long as you got it justly, whether it be inheritance or anything like that, as long as the root cause is just, you're right to have it.
yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm gonna punt back to you, Nick. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure either, which is, this is why libertarians are so persuasive on the internet.
But their positions are really interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a robustness to it, which you have to respect. My first thought, though, is that sort of going back to the original position is like, okay, maybe I'll admit to Nozick that yeah, I don't necessarily want to empower the state to infringe upon these things, and I may even go as far as Nozick to say that it's immoral. But going back to the original position, if I'm not that well off in society, if I'm born with all this talent and I don't have the means to advance my life or any of these things, it'd be difficult to call that society just. It'd be difficult to say, well, all these rich people, they got their stuff legitimately, and I don't really like the ways in which we would take it from them. Therefore, it's not. Therefore, the society we have in which me and my family are impoverished is just. That's sort of it's counterintuitive. Just in the same way as it is in the original position.
Yeah, the whole thing is kind of interesting. I suppose like one of the moves like that I'm thinking I would, if I'm Rawls, one of the moves I'm gonna make too is like, well, I guess Nozick just has to flat out deny the whole social contract thing to begin with, because I guess in some ways it's like, or at least like the version of it that Rawls has going on, because it's like if you accept the sort of like process that you're going through with the original position and coming to these sorts of like principles of justice, um, you're in some way agreeing to this.
Mm.
Like that seems to be like that seems to be one of the things that's going on with
And empowering the state to take
yeah. I mean
measures that it needs to take.
that seems to be exactly what you're doing, right? So you're leaving this sort of like situation where, or you're saying, okay, we need some mechanism, we need some structure to redistribute and to protect our rights and so on and so forth. We're going to let the state do it. In some ways, that seems to be what you have to say if you're Rawls. Whereas it seems like you're going to get something from Nozick like, well, I didn't sign no damn contract kind of thing, you know? It's like, I you guys might have signed this contract. I didn't sign it. So in a lot of ways, that might be the kind of thing you have to say as a Rawlsian, is something like, well, you agreed to this or whatever. How persuasive that is, I don't know. I don't particularly like the response, but it seems like it's something that you can do. Because then if you make that response, you do get the, okay, well, why is it that these people who made this contract X amount of years ago, why is it that I'm still bound by this contract? Or all of the sorts of issues that social contract theory in general runs into. There are a hell of a lot of moves open to Nozick where there just aren't so many for Rawls. So it seems like you have to go with something like, you agreed to it, you agreed to the social contract, or it's rational, and you should or you would agree to the social contract had you had the opportunity to actually sign it or whatever.
That's probably going to be Rawls's play, right? Because I don't see how Nozick can say, well, no, it's not rational. Because, say what you want about the original position, but Rawls, he makes up the rules and then he plays a game within that set of rules.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I mean, I think you can do that, but like, I wonder how persuaded. I'm not sure that Nozick or other libertarians are going to buy that in a lot of ways, because it still seems like you have to tell a story about like about the permissibility of all these different things, about giving the state all of this power that you're giving it. And I don't know that you can do that with what Rawls has said. In a lot of ways, it just seems like you kind of have to. I guess it also presumes certain things, like when you're talking about, and this is going to take us to other parts of like justice as fairness, but like, I guess it also comes down to like him talking about, or presuming that this is what's going on already in like a democratic society and stuff like that. So you've got this state, you've agreed you want a state. Now we're just trying to figure out what we want the state to do.
Yeah.
And then Nozick is, I guess you have a few more things that you have to convince him of, right? Because it seems like and again, like you said, and like I agree to, no Nozick expert here, but it seems to me like, I mean, that's the first part of his project, is to be like, well, we've got to get past this anarchy thing before we can even get anywhere else. But that's going to take us way into the weeds, and I'm not gonna take you there.
Yeah, that's probably wise. But yeah, as much as I know about Nozick, I know that he argues for like the minimally invasive state, to maintain property rights and things like that.
That's basically the extent of my Nozick knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to take too much of your time, Matt, but I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
So I'm teaching political philosophy in an ethics class, which I wake up every morning and wonder if that's a good idea. Um, so I'm curious if you have any, ideas, mostly for me, um, as to what does this have to do with ethics?
What does it have to do with ethics?
Yeah, talking about justice.
I mean, my initial response is to say something like, well, it has everything to do with it.
Typical
But I
philosopher.
mean, especially if you're talking about anything that you want to apply. I mean, it's like by most, if you're so many so many issues in ethics, you don't just want to do from the armchair. We don't just want to sit and think about, right? Like you kind of want to put these things into action. So if you think it matters that some people are significantly worse off than others through no fault of their own, you should care about political philosophy. If you think it matters whether someone has a right to tax you and to take your stuff and give it to other people, it matters to you. So if you think that whether or not someone or whether or not you should have to say, oh my gosh, in how, you know, society is structured, whether or not people should have, rights to vote, all sorts of things like that. This stuff matters. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think that the questions of justice are, I don't think that ethics is just about how like you should live as like an individual, but it's also a question about how you should structure your society.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in a lot of ways, like takes you right into political philosophy. I don't know how you, in a lot of, I don't even know how you can do one without the other now, the more that I think about it. But yeah.
That's well said.
Well, thanks. But yeah, do more political philosophy.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that we've accomplished here what we needed to accomplish. Do you have any closing thoughts, Matt?
Not really. I like the way you set this up. Or I like the way you set up the readings and stuff. Anyway, I think it's good to see after I've admitted that I know very little about Nozick, but still, I think it's really smart to do Rawls and Nozick together, especially since they were doing this kind of thing roughly the same time, or at least like theory of justice anyway. So justice, fairness, early 2000s, I think.
No, 1970s.
Theory of justice, 1970s. Justice is fairness, though.
Oh,
the restatement, what
right.
you're reading is like really early 2000s. But yeah, not that bad. But yeah, so Nozick and so Anarchy, State, Utopia, and Theory of Justice like at the same time, which is cool. And I think they both have really, really good stuff to say. And yeah, I think it's a good idea to read the sort of Rawlsian liberal view beside Nozick's libertarian view. I think it's cool. I think it's fun. But yeah, that's really, I mean, I don't have much else on that to say.
Well, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, man.
The jury's out on whether it'll be fun, but I appreciate
oh, dude,
it's time to do this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
get some good arguments going, and it'll be cool.
Thanks, dude.